Keith has quite a diverse background in the tech industry. He has had sales roles at Business Objects, SAP, WSI as a consultant. So he's been around for a long time, and he recently joined up at Traction and now is taking over Traction Guest. He has over 20 years of experience, extensive knowledge in the enterprise software space, identifying strategic trends and celebrating the importance of data, very sexy, BI and innovation. According to his LinkedIn, in order of importance, Keith is a husband, father, cyclist, runner, leader. Ouch, Keith. I literally wrote that down because I was on your LinkedIn. I was like, oh, interesting. No one found that funny. Moving on. As an expert in SaaS and CEO of an enterprise software company, Traction Guest, he sees a critical business requirement and opportunity in transforming visitor management with emerging technology to significantly improve physical and data security worldwide. Wow, that's a mouthful, but we got through it. A warm round of applause for Keith. Your mic, anywhere you like. Yeah. Really excited to have him. Kim Logan, who is the Strategic Programs Director at Telus with the Internet of Things program. She's worked with the company since 2005. During her tenure at Telus, she focused on government relations, very fascinating in my mind, smart cities, and building market assessments. Did you help with this building, like in terms of a GR kind of role? A little bit, yeah. Okay. Just curious. During her, currently, she's with the IoT team, focusing on a number of key strategies and working on the tech sector incubator programming and business strategy for transportation solutions. She's an experienced leader in the Vancouver business community with a passion for collaboration and engagement, which enables her to galvanize, support, and deliver positive results at work and in the community. Kim has volunteered her time and expertise to a number of boards and committees, including the Minerva Foundation for BC Women, the Victoria Telus Community Board, the Telus World of Science Government Relations Committee, the BC College of Dental Hygienists, I'm reading them all, Board and Registration Committee, the Business Council of BC Board and Executive Committee. She's also served as the Vice Chair of the Justice Institute of BC's Board of Governors and Chair of BC's Next Leaders Council. She's currently a member of Cascadia Committee on Housing, Transportation, and Connectivity, a cross-border initiative to foster a global innovation ecosystem for the Pacific Northwest. She's completed her MBA from the University of Victoria, and she loves her employer, Telus. But what a amazing commitment to the community. Thank you so much, Kim, for giving back and giving your time today. A warm round of applause for Kim. And I'm going to get started. I'm just going to take my phone out in case my mom calls. And thank you guys so much. I'm very excited to have this conversation, and how I always like to start off, if no one stalked everyone on LinkedIn like I did. Keith, why don't you tell us a little bit about your career path? As I mentioned earlier, I noticed you worked at SAP and a few other places that have really created a lot of business leaders in the local tech community before joining Traction on Demand. Why don't you share that with us and kind of give us a little bit about your background?
Sure. I've been around. I thank you for the description, by the way. I heard old and sexy. That's all I heard out of that whole diatribe. But besides that, I would say I have been around tech a long time, and I've been really fortunate in Vancouver to land in some really good companies early. So I worked in a company called Seagate Info, and that turned into Crystal Reports, which became Business Objects, got gobbled up by SAP. And in that journey, in the corporate setting, there was a lot of really good people who came out of it. So current CEO of Marketo, COO of Marketo, current founder of Traction On Demand, which actually incubated our company, Traction Guest, which I'm now leading, as well as a number of other really impressive companies in town. And I was really fortunate to work through those companies and work in different departments, and it really led me to the position where I could start leading a company and say, hey, I know what it's like to live in customer success, the promise keepers, and I know what it's like to be in sales, the promise makers. And I know that every other department, including dev, wonders why sales gets to go on sales trips, right? So it's really interesting to have worked in all the different departments and understand the different perspectives in a technology company, and I did that in some really wonderful companies. And out of that, I'm now CEO of Attraction Guest, which is coming out of Traction On Demand, and that's enabled me to see different viewpoints and really lead the company in a way where I can say, hey, I understand what you're going through.
What made you join Traction On Demand? You mentioned you've worked with a number of these people before. What were some of your kind of key decision factors in choosing Traction as opposed to a number of other companies?
Yeah, so just for some history, if you haven't heard of it, Traction On Demand is a 600-person Salesforce consulting and integration shop. They do a lot of development as well. And when I went there, I worked with the CEO, Greg, at the time, and we had worked around each other in some of these companies. And he said, hey, Keith, I think we see again and again business needs where we should create some product companies. And that's really hard to do out of a services company. There's many who've tried, and it's difficult because you have two different business models that you're serving. But Greg had a vision for how we could actually take resources and really dedicate them to that. So Traction Guest is a good example of one that's come out of Traction On Demand. We started that not 4 years ago. We're at 60 people now. We finished our seed round last April, and we'll announce our A round, which closed last week, this week. And we're at 60 people. We're serving 500 companies, all paying, no freemium, and we're on 5 continents around the world. So it's been an exciting go.
Are you in Antarctica?
No, we're not. I don't think so.
5
Good
continents.
question, though,
I know,
yeah.
right? I'm wondering which continent you're missing. It's pretty much easy to assess which one that is. And what does your role encompass at Traction Guest?
So we're an incubated company. So coming out of a company, there's a huge advantage to us that we knew we had a really good idea, and we knew businesses needed it, and we knew it would evolve just like any other software category quite quickly.
Sorry, I'm just going to interrupt. Why don't you explain what the software is? Because some people,
I
think,
get there.
may not. Yeah.
Perfect. So the idea that we had and the need that we had was essentially big businesses around the world have people coming in and out of them all the time. They go to their lobbies and their events, but they don't know who visited them. Many of the companies that we deal with have regulatory bodies that are responsible to be able to audit and say, hey, we know who's coming in and out of our environments. So they have to check in. So historically, not long ago, you would see a lot of paper books where people would write the name down. We did a bunch of research on that 4 years ago and said, hey, why are you doing that? And they really didn't know. They'd say, because maybe John told us to 10 years ago. And we're like, is John here anymore? No. So why are you making people write their name down? And do they feel welcome? Do they feel safe, remembered? And they're like, no, none of those. We don't know why. It sucks. And we do that in every one of our locations, and some of these companies have hundreds of locations. So we created an iPad app, very simple to begin with, and now that's based off of a cloud platform. So we have companies with hundreds of locations now having people checking in other lobbies and at their events and collecting that data on individuals and doing things like watch list and pushing that information into CRM and a bunch of other different use cases around making sure they know who's coming and going to the company.
Exciting. I love a good compliance sales pitch. Sorry, I'm an ex-ACLer. Thanks for laughing. I'm just going to shift over to Kim. Kim, you seem to have taken a path that's a little bit more related to public policy to get to Telus. Why don't you tell us a little bit about it? I kind of alluded to it earlier on today.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I don't have the deep expertise that Keith does in the tech sector, because sort of took a different path to get here, but spent most of my career in working either inside of government or in a government relations capacity for small companies, as well as here at Telus. I think you noticed from Bindy's introduction that that I've been here for quite a while, spent quite a bit of time in government relations, and I think the relevance here, and Keith mentioned regulatory requirements. There's a lot of drivers out there that are a result of government requirements, regulation, legislation, and it is important to pay attention to your environment. So that served me well in my new role working within the IoT team at Telus. But the reason for the career shift is, merely did an MBA, kind of thought there was a lot more to learn out there in the world, and Telus thankfully gave me an opportunity to do a bit of a career shift, and it's been a great learning experience so far.
And speaking of kind of your new role with the IoT team, you're the strategic programs director. Why don't you speak a little bit about what that role encompasses?
Sure. So you can tell by the title that you have no way of knowing what I work on because it's really ambiguous. But when I first came to the team, I was doing a little bit of exploratory work in the smart cities realm, and it was quite fascinating that when you look at the Canadian market versus other markets in Europe, Asia, we actually have a lot of space here. We don't have the same kinds of pressures that other parts of the world have around dealing with congestion, urbanization. So it's a great growing market here, but it's a little bit slower paced. So I was asked to then focus on a go-to-market strategy for a new low-power wide area network called LTE-M, the first kind of purpose-built IoT network that is enabled through licensed cellular networks. So for some of you regular folks, you may have seen me first pop up last fall. As we went through a process of understanding who our key customers were and who would benefit the most from this network, we realized that it probably was the early startups, because there's a lot of IoT companies out there that have solutions. They're a little bit more mature. You present this new technology opportunity to them, and they just kind of see dollar signs because they know that that would require transformation of their technology, and it's not something you can do overnight. So we thought, wouldn't it be interesting to actually engage with early stage startups and give them an opportunity to be a bit of a disruptor in the market and maybe even shoot past some of those more mature IoT companies. So that was our thinking. That was last year, and now, and I'm happy to talk more about that, obviously, since it's relevant to our discussion. But lately, I've been working on trying to build out our transportation solutions portfolio.
It's very exciting. Mm-hmm. It's such a big, hot topic issue here in Vancouver. So we'll be excited to hear more about that as we kind of dive into tonight's subject, which is the startup ecosystem. So both of you, many of you are probably like, oh, they come from such diverse backgrounds. One has worked, in building the startup ecosystem here in Vancouver through her community giving and kind of working through a number of community initiatives, as well as Telus kind of being the incumbent provider here in British Columbia and setting up access to internet and that sort of thing, and that communications platform. And Keith, on the other end, has kind of given back by working with a number of startups in the local community and really kind of developing that talent base. So I think one's kind of more infrastructure and one's a little bit more talent based. And we thought it was really important to kind of showcase both sides of the equation of what it takes to build an ecosystem here in Vancouver. So before, I just wanted to explain that because I had a few people being like, how is this conversation going to work? But there's some thought put into it. And before we jump into kind of some of the deeper questions, I thought we'd start off with a basic question around, tell us about your view of the Vancouver and broader tech ecosystem. We can start with you, Keith.
Sure. So it's an interesting one. I think Vancouver has a lot to offer besides the resources and the setting, which is important. I think it has a lot of diversity. And our company has quickly started selling internationally. We actually didn't realize this, but we ended up to the point where we're at about 60 people now, and we actually have 14 original countries of birth in the team. And we didn't even start that way. We just sort of said, hey, let's continue hiring great people, and that's what happened. Now, the funny thing about that is with that diversity, when you're trying to sell international software, comes influence. And the influence in the software makes it more appealing internationally as well. So that's a huge opportunity in the software development cycle and just in product marketing and how you're actually taking product to market if you're trying to sell to companies that are internationally based companies. So that's a major advantage in Vancouver.
And how about yourself, Kim? How would you define the Vancouver tech ecosystem and the broader ecosystem?
Yeah, we spend a lot of time looking at the tech ecosystem across the country, and it is really interesting to see that there are a number of differences among the different regions. For example, the Toronto ecosystem tends to be a little bit more mature, larger companies, a little more advanced, whereas our ecosystem here in Vancouver is younger, but it also produces a lot of innovation because of that, with some specialty areas starting to emerge as well. For example, healthcare is there's a bit of a cluster developing around healthcare. So it's really interesting from that standpoint. I also observed some differences between BC and Alberta. We ran an incubator program we launched it in January and ran it for a couple of months. Our cohort was focused on BC and Alberta. We had approximately, I think, 16 companies participating, so about half and half. And both cohorts did great. And I don't know if it's a function of the broader ecosystem in Vancouver or just a function of the actual companies that were participating, but the Vancouver cohort did have a lot of high engagement, high energy. They really fed off each other. The profile of the startups tended to be a little bit on the younger side, not really in terms of age profile, just the actual tenure of the companies was younger. And I think they really thrived as a cohort. The Alberta cohort did well as well, but they were a little more further along in their journey. So we saw less transformation among those companies.
Very interesting. And I think that speaks a lot to kind of Vancouver and its support of small business and innovation comparative to other parts of Canada. Not saying that they're lacking, but it's just something you see a lot more in places where there's a diverse population, as you spoke to earlier, because that immigrant experience is oftentimes embedded in starting businesses of their own. So
yeah, and I think in Alberta they are going through a bit of a transformation right now because they've traditionally been very focused on the energy sector, and they know they need to diversify their economy. So they're going through a bit of a transition. The organization that we delivered the incubator program with is an organization called Platform Calgary. So we were able to, we did have pretty good reach into that ecosystem, and they, when you look at the so-called winners of our incubator program, so we picked a top 4 companies that we thought really benefited from the program and showed a lot of promise. So we had 2 of them from Alberta and 2 from BC. So lots of interesting companies coming out of there. But I think because this ecosystem here in Vancouver is much more diversified, I think you see a lot more collaboration and innovation of ideas here.
Speaking of kind of startups, would you each define what a startup means to you? I know you incubated within a company and you support startups, but what is your definition of a startup?
Yeah, I can grab that one. I think when you think of the definition, it's really what is it to you? Like, what's a personal impact of being a startup? And in a true startup, I think a lot of times they face pressures that are immense. There's a lot of uncertainty, and for me, when you're starting something up, that can exist in a big company as well as net new. The pressures are really what sort of form out it's going to turn into. And for me, when I think of a number of different things, I've worked in some larger companies and tried to start efforts. You really just got to start peeling them apart. You got to take that problem and say, hey, I see a solution here, and what I want to do is solve it. And then I want to put people around me to help with that. For me, when I start seeing that happen, I can really see that startup thing starting to come together. And I think a lot of bigger companies are doing that because the cost of innovation around them, if they don't, is getting high. There's a lot of people nibbling away at very established companies who aren't able to innovate anymore. So I think that's why there's some really good thinking around, like Jeffrey Moore has done some great stuff in a book called Zones to Win, and sort of pulling out successful ideas in established companies and really forming what you can table as a startup. I think when you get into what's entrepreneurial versus a startup is also very interesting. That risk that a true entrepreneur takes of actually sort of rolling the dice with the finances and their personal situations is intriguing, really intriguing. And I think the two get mixed together very often, startup and entrepreneur, and they're not quite the same. They're a little bit different.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Kim, do you have anything to add to that?
I'm not going to pretend to know how to answer that question, but I do think some of it has to do with your, the posture that you take, the culture within your organization. I know that for my team, we kind of feel like a startup inside of Telus, because Telus is, our roots go back pretty deep, especially in BC and Alberta. So within that environment, we are trying to build out a new business that is software-based, and it's quite new. So we kind of feel like a startup within our company. But in terms of when we're looking at the tech sector, we do make some distinctions between the early stage startups and the more mature startups. And then I'm not sure when they become full-fledged just tech companies and they kind of lose that startup label. But definitely when we were looking at creating an incubator to complement, we already have a Telus Technology Accelerator, and that's in its third year of operation right now. So the definition for who would qualify for the incubator versus the accelerator was simply about customers and revenue. So incubator, early stage startups, no customers, no revenue, but they have an MVP that they're working on. More mature startups, they do have customers, they've got revenue, they've done proofs of concept, and it's really more about trying to accelerate their growth and get them to that next level so that they can have exponential growth.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, there's a bit of a mentality mix in there too. Like Telus has done a good job in really trying to build that mentality of a startup in a large company. And it's funny, right? Because you start early days and you're all rushing towards an idea and you're all trying to make an impact and bite and scratch and find a customer and say, hey, let's prove the idea is real and hire more people around it. And then you start to say, hey, what's going on? Like, we're growing faster, things are slowing down. Why, right? And it goes a lot to that mentality of, are you willing to take a risk? And in big companies, that's often hard to do. And big companies doesn't have to be really big because it becomes dangerous to take a risk.
And
by
I think
risk, that's something
do you
we have
mean
to be
like
careful
innovation?
Personal risk.
Okay.
Saying, hey, I'm going to take what maybe the core business is doing, and I'm going to take a risk and say maybe it's not doing it well, or maybe it could be done different, or maybe there's some other idea that we should be looking at. Oftentimes, I think companies get a mentality where that's not celebrated. It's actually something that's detrimental. So we keep an eye on that even as we grow.
Do you, like, just kind of going back to large corporations and oftentimes that innovation or that risk-taking endeavor that they're not willing to take those risks or innovate and kind of rock the boat in a way. Do you think skunkworks kind of projects help eliminate certain things like that, where it keeps that innovation running along, and is that an important factor at Traction or Telus? I
think yes and no. I mean, there are departments, especially in our technology strategy department, they'll do some testing and run some projects. But I really do believe that you need that executive support from the top to support these it is a different way of thinking. It is risk-taking to breed a culture where you're willing to fail, because it's not always going to work out. So you got to be okay with failing. And it really is a bit of a cultural shift. So it's difficult to do because, it's just, human beings are kind of wired to favor the status quo and not to want to change. So it does take effort, but I do think the executive support is important.
Yeah, I'd completely agree with that. I think in that definition of startup, you have to assume there's going to be investment. And with investment comes risk, right? And it's going to take time. Any technology idea, and that's mostly what I'm familiar with, is on the enterprise software side of the business. You can't get anything off the ground without at least a couple of years of testing the market, finding your message, and making sure that it lands on buyers. And then they have to generate the budgets and the ability to purchase it, and all of that takes time, patience, and vision. And if you don't have that executive sponsorship, it can be very frustrating because people will peel back to what has been succeeding. And it's an intriguing phenomenon, I think. And not, again, I don't think it's just really big companies. I think any company that's scaling has to look out for it. When you end up in those meetings and you're sitting around together and nobody's really challenging the status quo anymore because the personal connections are different, you're going in the wrong direction from a startup mentality.
Agreed. Yeah, and then in I walk and set everything on fire. Just kidding, but not really. We talked a little bit about internally kind of building that ecosystem, and now let's look outwards and see what makes an ecosystem tick in an urban community such as Vancouver. And one of the things that we often look at as the gold standard of the best ecosystem is San Francisco. And so with that being said, what do you think that they've done right, that those are lessons that we could learn and hopefully implement here in Vancouver?
Do you want to start? Okay, I'll grab this one. So I just spent 2 to 3 months in the Valley, and we decided to go with a venture capital company from San Francisco, and we looked at them everywhere, and there's fantastic venture capital companies all over the place. I would say one of the things about San Francisco is that it has a drive to push innovation in a way that's thirsty like you can't believe. So if you look at the number of companies that have IPO'd from a technology standpoint, look at the numbers behind where they came from, the Valley speaks very loud. So there's some very smart people there. But there's very smart people here too. And I think when you look at Vancouver, one of the differences between San Francisco and Vancouver potentially is just the amount of investment that you're able to get and the speed at which you can go. And we've been really fortunate because we find Vancouver to have great talent, and it has great immigration policies to pull talent from other countries. We're bringing a number of people from Brazil right now and really enjoying bringing the developers from there and changing some lives. You can't do that as easily in the Valley. So our cost as well is a lot different than the Valley because it's not as competitive. But that mentality of just growing fast and grabbing a market and creating a moat and owning it is phenomenally interesting. And I think a lot of technology companies in Vancouver are going to benefit by just getting themselves surrounded by that, because that is the way of the future. Money is available, technology is adaptable, and we're growing at a quick pace. Everything around us is waiting for somebody to make it more efficient. So you got to grab that.
You kind of alluded to the decision-making process is a lot faster in the U.S. With that being said, do you find yourself selling to Americans a lot faster than Canadian companies?
We have 87% of our revenues from the States already, so it's largely from the States. And I think that's possibly due to the market that we're going after. We're going after large enterprises, so many of them are headquartered from there, right? So for us, I think there's a little bit of that. I think it's dangerous to start characterizing countries, because even if you sell in Western U.S. compared to Eastern U.S., it's just different, right? Like, they're not the same places. So I think buyers are looking for solutions that can make them look good because they're changing things in their company. We center on that really carefully. And from there, we just enter the businesses that are looking for our level of solution, and just knowing that segment well is helpful. So I don't think it's necessarily they make quicker decisions as purchasers.
Disagree.
Depends where you're selling in the
Yeah,
US.
exactly, I guess.
West Coast sale is very different than an East Coast.
Yeah, that's very true. Vancouver versus San Francisco. Kim, do you have anything to add to that? Like, what makes San Francisco tick comparative to Vancouver?
I think people are probably aware of all the different, studies and evaluation of why a Silicon Valley is what it is. And it really does have to do with the concentration of people and companies. And we are seeing that happen here. I mentioned healthcare as an example. And that it's just, it's that, and I think part of it is the new way of doing business is quite different than what we used to do. So it used to be that you had pretty much anyone you would look at, you'd see as a competitor. And there wouldn't be a lot of information sharing, cooperation. And now it's just completely different. I think people are looking for collaboration models. You see the rise of platform companies. It's just a totally different in business environment that we're working within. And it does lend itself to the creation of these innovation hubs. So even in places like Victoria, Kelowna, they've got their own on a smaller scale, but their own ecosystems that have built up around tech. And I think it really is it's ultimately about people. And to make a shameless plug for one of the committees that I'm sitting on, the Cascadia Corridor Committee, that's what that's actually all about. That's about recognizing that the Pacific Northwest, so let's try and break down that border, but the Pacific Northwest is actually a great geographic region to foster innovation and other, not just within the tech sector, but generally speaking, economic opportunities for the people who live there. So you've got people or companies, big companies like Microsoft involved in that because it's about trying to foster the free flow of people and talking about things like high-speed rail to make it easier for us to actually connect with one another.
The new version of the EU. That could go sideways, though. They say, like, I remember hearing this like kind of early on that the most important ingredients to a startup ecosystem were great ideas, great talent, which you spoke about, great capital, or great customers. Which area are you most concerned about in regards to Vancouver?
For us, we're focused on the enterprise market largely. We are selling to the typical SMB as well, but there's just less large enterprises here. So that's a concern. But I think on the talent front, it's exciting. Like we're really excited about what Vancouver's offering from a talent perspective. So I think it's mostly customers. More sizable customers here just means there's going to be a more vibrant community to sell to if you're selling to that community.
Kim?
Yeah, I would agree with that, but I do hear people talking a lot about talent and the challenges recruiting the right talent. So I do think that that is an area of focus that any company doing business here needs to think a little bit outside the box about how to recruit talent.
And what do you think that is? Like, just kind of out of a curiosity level, do you think, I agree, I think we have great talent. Are we not incentivizing them correctly? Are we, having still, are people not being mentored in the right way where we're building leaders that are staying within the ecosystem? What challenges? I think we do have a great batch of talent, but there are serious challenges within talent here. What are you finding is something that we need to start addressing? I personally think it's a livable wage. And there's a number of tech companies that we're not going to go into naming names, but like not paying interns. And I'm a person who pays interns. Even there's tons of ways you can do that. So what are you finding is the biggest challenge right now with the talent pool?
Well, I think, there's two ways to solve that. And so I'm a big proponent of looking at our local pipeline and making sure that we can fill that as much as possible, because these are, well-paying jobs for the most part, unless you're an intern at one of those companies, I guess. But we do need to work with our local institutions, just make sure that that students find opportunities at those institutions and know what the career path would be. How to actually get on the right career path and have those opportunities. If you're looking at recruiting from outside of Canada, then you do have a bit of a challenge around being competitive in terms of wages here in Canada. So that is a challenge, but I think that there are a lot of upsides of living and working in Canada, especially recently. I think people are favoring working in a country like Canada, and that works to our benefit.
Yeah, we've got some great values, socially progressive, access to great lifestyle. There's a lot of great things, but sometimes the economics comes down to it. But Keith, you were about to say something, and I.
Yeah, no, I think from our standpoint, like we actually are going to open a Seattle office as well, and that's just about diversity too, right? Just having more access to other markets of people. I would say one of the things we've noticed is as you start growing as a company, you do start wanting to bring people who've done it before. And in the Valley and Seattle and whatnot, you have a lot of people who've gone through companies who've scaled. So when we decided to look for a VP of engineering, we ended up with somebody who had worked at Amazon and Groupon historically, right? Ironically, he'd made the decision to move to Vancouver for personal reasons because he wanted to be in Canada with his family. We did the same kind of thing when we looked around Vancouver for other roles, and it can be difficult to find people if you're sort of hitting that trajectory where you're past the point where you have a viable product and a market that you're chasing, and you want to have some people who can come in and help the people who are upskilling in the organization. That can be a difficult thing, and I think in the Valley there's a huge advantage there because there's just so many companies that are growing fast, and there's so many opportunities for people to be a part of that. So they bring that experience to whatever else they're working in.
This is just like a weird fact that I was reading the other day. Like unemployment in the U.S. is at 3%, which is causing employees to finally have the leg up on employers, and it can lead to obviously things like inflation and all of that. We're not at such an unemployment rate, and brain drain is starting to happen. So I think you guys have raised some really interesting points of what we can do to make sure we're retaining that talent and also attracting talent, and I think it's the most important part of building this ecosystem is the people in it. So just want to move on and kind of close that off. I remember reading something by Reid Hoffman stating, you must be empathetic at the same time, you must be brutally honest within the startup space. Do you agree or disagree? And how do you find such a balance?
Yeah, totally agree with that. I think just drawing back to the experience with the incubator, we really thought about how do we provide value to the companies that are participating, because time is so precious when you're an early stage startup. And so we had the programming heavily weighted towards what I would describe as business fundamentals, and required the startups participating to go through a business model canvas and really understand, like really nail down what's your value proposition, who are you selling to, what are you selling, and actually requiring them to conduct interviews with prospective customers to make sure that these customers would actually buy their product. Mm-hmm. And at the end of it, there were quite a few pivots within the program where people they were doing their final presentation, kind of a pitch style, and I'm sitting there thinking, is this the same company? Because 8 weeks ago you were saying something different, and it's just completely different, but it's much more focused and much more targeted. And one company, for example, actually changed their name as well during the process. But I think if you don't do that, then it's just a waste of time, right? If they're spending time on something that's not going to get them to where they're trying to get to, it's basically a waste of time. So you're doing people a favor if you're going to be brutally honest and ask those tough questions.
Great answer.
Yeah, I think for us, we focus very early on metrics as a company. I know it's a common thing to say, but how you use the metrics is really key. And I think with the pivots that you're talking about, really understanding the metrics and the timeline for those metrics, both being leading and lagging, is super important, because it's a very emotional thing as you go through the startup early stages, feeling like you have something and then knowing that you have to believe that and go with it. There's at some point you have to charge down a path, right? And you can't pontificate to the point where you don't take a path. By the same token, when do you know to get off it? And that's where we really carefully put a plan together. We used Lead and Canvas in the very beginning. And then we put a hire to performance plan in place with a budget. And we said, hey, if we start seeing these indicators as we move, we'll continue investing. And then once we saw those indicators come together, then we said, well, now we're going to make a critical decision around outside investment. And then another round of outside investment. But all of those decisions were guided. Fortunately, we have some really good board members who've done this before in Vancouver. So they were able to say, hey, here are the kind of things you want to look for. And that gives you a lot of comfort, because you don't want to get off the path or pivot too early, especially if you're trying to create a new category. So getting some guidance on determining what those indicators are if you're starting something are really helpful. Anybody who you can get who's been through it a ton of times, who can say, hey, if you start seeing this in this time frame, start taking these actions. So that's really important.
That's great. Like, listening to business leaders is really a key component to building a startup and having a successful startup. In order to kind of foster and nurture innovation and entrepreneurship, to build a long-lasting ecosystem, leadership is paramount. Like, I think it's super key. Who locally is a leader in the startup community that you look up to and kind of lean in to when you have questions, and what does that person do to contribute and sustain such contributions? Because it's hard, right? Like, they're being pulled in a million different directions. How do you get sustained feedback from them?
I'm kind of looking at Keith like.
I think that's a Keith
call
question.
Keith. I mean, like, I'm going to call Keith for advice in the future, because he's got a wealth of knowledge. I do think that some of these associations out there are really useful to even just talking to the people at the Canada's Digital Supercluster, for example. Some of the principals over there, you guys probably know Bill Tam, for example. They're putting a lot of thought into our local ecosystem here, because even though it's Canada's Digital Supercluster, they are based here, so they're looking at the local environment and really trying to think about how do they engage with the startup community, get more interest, build those connections between the bigger members of the supercluster, as well as the academic partners and then the smaller companies that can benefit from that sort of collaboration. So I find that talking to them is really useful, but also just going out there and meeting people who are in the community. One of the first companies that I met when I started my hunt to find these startups to tell me what I need to do with this new network I was launching. One of them is Open Spot Parking. They're up for one of the awards at the BC Tech Association dinner, and just getting their feedback has been really useful. So I think sometimes people overlook the fact that it is a two-way feedback mechanism.
I would say, find somebody who's excited about you. That'd be the place to start. Make sure that they have some experience that you can lean on, and then if they're excited about you and your story and what you're trying to accomplish, it'll go a long way. We're very fortunate, and I still to this day think one of the most important decisions we were able to get accomplished early days was to get Norm Francis on our board. Norm Francis founded Pivotal and ACPAC. We also have Greg Malpass on our board. Both of these gentlemen have started multiple companies. So in those moments when you're not sure, because you are, right? The experience really bleeds through. You don't need long conversations and business planning sessions as much. You just need to go to them and say, hey, here are the markers, here are the measures I'm seeing, what do you think? And this because they've done it so many times, right? This is where experience is really helpful, especially in business, because those pivots are costly, right? You take the wrong one and it's hard to pull back. If you can go to somebody like that who believes in you, wants to see you see you succeed, and has done it a number of times, is willing to be very honest with you and very direct, you're in a great place. So that'd be the profile I'd look for if you're looking for some advice.
And I think the same is true with just like one-on-one mentorship. And I think it's something that, as a part of this ecosystem that we're building, we need to figure out a program that works in nurturing and fostering that growth of young talent in this community. And I think it's a problem that we haven't solved yet, but it's something that I've talked to business leaders about. And, I think it should be something that hopefully you look after, because you're on every community board that I can think of.
Yeah, I'd jump in and I'd add to what you said, Kim, around it being two-way. There's a lot of individuals who want to be excited about you and what you're doing too, because they all did it. Like, they know what it feels like and they remember it, and they're like, hey, there's somebody here who's trying to do it again. So if you find them, be just really straightforward that you're trying to accomplish something big and great and you need a hand. And you'll tell right away, when people are into supporting you or not, right? They'll brush you off or they'll dig in. And when they dig in, give them what they need to know. That'd be a little bit of a tip too.
I think it's a great tip. I'm going to close off with kind of a strange question, but here we go. We hear a lot about the unicorn, or as someone dubbed for Canadian audiences, narwhals. With that being said, how do we prevent startups from becoming pies in the sky like a Theranos or some other local companies? What do you think is, how do we make sure that we keep that growth, but we're realistic? And it kind of goes back to that being brutally honest thing for me. Do you have anything else to add to that? I think it's the hype machine.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's, if you start a startup software company anywhere, you go and you talk to people. I've pitched a number of VCs, and I'll say, hey, we've tripled our revenue for the last 2 years, and looks like we're going to do it again, and then we're going to double. And they're like, yeah, Keith, that's great. But how's it going to be way bigger than that? And this is the mentality you get when you go to the Valley, right? Because they're looking for life-changing events. They're looking for companies that are going to change the world. And I think we find tweaks a lot of the times. And there's comforts in the tweaks, right? Because you actually get a paying customer and you're successful. You're like, this is awesome. And then you go to them and they're like, that's great, but how are you going to change the world? And they really want that. And I think there's a bit of a thing there where you have to decide what you're trying to create. Because if you're trying to create a small business, it's a lifestyle business and successful, it's okay. There's no shame in that. But if you're going to go look for money from people who want to see you change the world, you have to change the world, right? Or you at least have to try. So there's no like, I'm going in here and I might, or I'm thinking about it. It's sort of like you go all for it, right? So some of my recent experiences anyways.
That's great. Do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I don't know if your question was how do you prevent
It's an open-ended.
an open-ended question. I mean, I think that most companies do aspire to greatness, and that's great. But yeah, you do have to be realistic about how you're going to get there, and you don't want your ambitions to be too big that you can never really get off the ground. So it is a bit of a balance. I think that you do need to pay attention to your governance. All of those fundamentals. So it's not just you making all of the decisions, but to have those advisors. Maybe if you're too early, you're not really ready to have a board, but you can still create a committee of advisors to help steer your path a bit, give you some honest advice. I would like to think that investors won't invest in you if it's really just a dream on a paper, but I don't know. There are a lot of funders out there looking for the next big thing. So I don't know if that would be a bit of a safety net on that, but I do think, yeah, you need those checks and balances, and I think you need to take a bit of a growth mindset to the whole thing, where you're looking for the criticisms, you're seeking out who's going to push back on your plans, because that will make your end plan a lot better.
And the reason I ask that question is because successful companies breed other successful companies. It's really important to kind of have that gut check or that check and balance in ensuring that, you know, the companies that the local economy is supporting, government supporting, are being built, are growing in a successful manner that's not kind of pie in the sky. That's where I was getting at with that question. I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience. I'll walk around. We'll start over there. If anyone's got a question, could you kindly raise your hand? Whoa, this is a very engaged audience. I'll call you out. You've got one? Here you go.
It's pretty simple, but maybe not. Attaining new business. How? How do you?
So it was attaining new business,
Yeah.
getting new business.
Yeah.
You go tell people about it, and I'm not kidding. Like we actually we took our developers and we went door to door in Burnaby, knocking on businesses in the very beginning just to see how they'd react to our message. There is no shame allowed in asking for business. If you think you have an idea you believe in, you have to go ask people if they do too, and that's the best way to start. And you will learn so fast doing that. The other thing I recommend is trade shows. Take your idea to a trade show. Get a booth before you even have a lot of customers. And again, that real-time feedback just forms out like, hey, people are reacting to this message. They believe in the product or not. And just go tell people too, be honest. Just say, hey, it's early and I need you to believe in what we're up to. Will you listen to me? And you'd be surprised at how many will actually open the door and sit down with you and even invest with you early.
Did you ever feel like a Jehovah's Witness?
You know, that's why I said there's no shame. Like there's just not people. You will. I'm not going to address that, but you will. What was a reek of desperation? Maybe that's a good way of putting it. If you go in and you don't believe in your own idea and you're asking for somebody's money, you're a shyster. Like we brought customers on early because we believed they were better with us because what we were going to do, and we had put a very specific plan in place to do that. We've done the market analysis. We actually brought in a buyer and did a mind map and really understood what they needed. So if you're not there where you believe yet, you shouldn't do it. It's the wrong thing to do.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd also add that, you know, if your product is really solving a problem for a customer, you're doing them a favor. So if you're, you know, in the early stages, you need to be asking your prospective customers, does this, I think it solves a problem for you. What can you tell me a little bit more about how you see your problem? And then tweaking your product so that it does actually solve that problem. And then when you go back out to look for those, you might be looking for a pilot customer or you want to do a proof of concept. It should be fairly easy to do that if you're genuinely solving that customer's problem. They'll be interested to know what you can do for them. If you're not charging them, that's great. They'll probably say yes. And then you can also get intelligence around, well, how much would you pay for this? You know, I think this solution is going to save you X dollars, so would you be willing to pay, you know, 25% of that on the monthly basis? And if they say yes, then, you know, you're kind of on your way.
Out of curiosity, Greg, did you guys offer a freemium version of the product when you initially started off?
We didn't actually.
Good job.
We said you're going to pay. We didn't give it away. I would say we had a couple of early friends that we went in and said, hey, we'll sort of put you on an early cab, like a customer advisory board. But that was like 2 or 3 companies, and then from there it was just like, hey, thanks for the feedback. Now you have to pay.
I agree with that, but anyone over here? Okay, we're going to pass it down. Sorry. Thank you.
So this one's for Keith. You were saying like there's a difference between an East Coast and a West Coast sale, right? So I just want to kind of know a little specifics.
Yeah, hey, we talk about diversity. Like there's difference between East Vancouver, Canada and West Vancouver, West Canada as well, even West Vancouver probably. But like there's just differences. Like at the end of the day, you have to adapt to those differences. If you go to the East Coast, you will likely, especially if you're selling into New York or a place like that, have a very direct conversation. which is much shorter and to the point, and they're not being offensive necessarily. That's just the culture of doing business there. If you go to the West Coast, you could have a meeting where it seems like it was great, and they walk out of it and don't tell you how much they thought it was terrible. And that's sort of the West Coast. Now, those are all generalizations because people are not the same even in these regions, but just be aware of what you're going into and pay attention and know that people are different, and that's okay. You're just going to have to find a way to communicate with them.
All right, cool.
Any other questions? Okay, Hussein.
Thank you, Keith and Kim. That was a great conversation. There's a lot of good things about the startup mindset, the being agile, being able to pivot, always thinking about disrupting. Give us the other side. What is not that good about a startup mindset? And you see very often that companies grow and they've gone from 6 to 60 to 600, and you still hear, oh, there's a startup mindset here. When does it become not that great? And what are the things that probably lead to some sort of disruption of the business, actually?
It tests your mental fortitude being in a startup, right? You will question yourself and you'll question everything around you on a regular basis. And then when you make a decision to pivot and stick and go, there's going to be a lot of reasons why you wonder whether you should. And this isn't even just startup as a company. Like leaving a well-established company feels like that. I worked at SAP for 10 years, and stepping into a company that was 15, I really questioned myself at times. That doesn't feel good, right? Like it's much better not to feel that way. But like anything, if you look at what grows and becomes something impressive, it usually hurts a little bit. So you got to just look at it that way and say, this hurts, but I've made the decision to do it, and I'm going with it. Commit to it. He works for Traction Guest, so we just have to be clear. This could be a plant.
No, my question is actually for the other lady. So a question that I kind of face in terms of startup mentality, especially talking about with San Francisco versus Canada or versus Vancouver and whatnot, especially around the idea of PHI and big data sets in the healthcare environment getting released in the States versus not getting released up here. How does Canada intend to kind of compete in that space, not just with personal health information, but also with just data in general? Because I know that there's wide varieties of regulations around data compliance, and Canada, depending on the government at the time, can be completely different. So,
okay, how much time do we have? I actually spent 3 years working as the chief of staff to the Minister of Health. I don't want to tell you when because it'll totally date me, but it was a while ago. Anyway, and that was okay. It was almost 20 years ago. And at that time, that minister actually was quite passionate about exactly what you're talking about. Yet today, we're still struggling to do that. So some of it has to do with, I think, the technology that drives these databases. They're really old, and there's just, you need the policy frameworks, but you also need the technology platforms to be able to ingest data, basically cleanse it, and then make sure that it gets to the right places. So now you're talking about things like data exchanges, and it's pretty new. It's emerging as a technology. I think that the Canada's Digital Supercluster Initiative will actually tackle some of those issues. I know that they've got some projects that have been now approved for the first round of projects. I'm pretty sure there's a couple of health data related projects there, but I don't know if it's going to unlock the government's data sets or not. There's another company that we've worked with, a great startup called Urban Logic, and they're basically doing something similar to that in the municipal sector. So they literally camp out at City Hall and convert or unlock the data in these, I don't know if they're in servers or where they are, but they literally spend time trying to unlock that data and then blending it with new data sources so that they can, the cities can have better decision-making processes around what to do about new infrastructure, traffic management, and it is, you're right, it's totally, it's where we need to get to in the future, and I hope we'll get there, but it might take a while.
Yeah, in the startup world, I'd say take it seriously. Like, if you don't invest in a SOC 2 as a tech company really early, you're going to pay for it later, because you're going to end up with in front of an InfoSec team that's going to peel you like a banana. So do it as soon as you can. This is a plug for PwC. We're doing a great job with them right now. I really enjoy working with them, but they're doing our SOC 2, and we did it really young, and that's because we made it a value. So the reality is nobody knows what these regulations are what they're coming down on, but our customers face them. So we said it's a value for us to actually be very diligent on doing things like SOC 2 and helping our clients when they get asked how we're managing their data, so that whatever they face in the future from a regulatory standpoint, we can deal with. And if you don't do that, you're just not going to be able to compete and play in the enterprise space, because that's the pressure they face.
What does SOC 2 stand for?
Sarbanes? No, I can't
Oh,
even.
it's Sarbanes-Oxley,
Yeah.
the two senators. Okay.
Yeah, so there's a SOC 2 and
That's
then
how good,
usually type 1, and
Yeah,
then
yeah.
you go through your type 2 a little bit later. We're going through our type 2 right now.
Obama regulations, yeah, okay.
The other helpful framework is privacy by design. So, if you're dealing with data that has any potential to impact people, has any linkage to people, you should look at the privacy by design framework and just read it. I mean, it actually makes complete sense. But the problem is that some companies don't do that in the front end, and then realize they didn't get the proper user consents that they should have. So now, do they have the right to access that data or not? So you do have to understand what best practice looks like, and do it right from the start, so that you don't find yourself offside.
If you want a really fun reading assignment, read the GDPR regulations, because that's a good time. Thank you so much. You guys have been absolutely a fantastic conversation. We've got the space until about 9 o'clock before Kim kicks us out. But a round of applause for both Keith and Kim.